Well, it's down to the wire again as Greece's 4-month loan agreement extension is poised to run out at the end of the month. Greece says it can't repay the money owed and warns it may exit the Eurozone. Joining us now for more on the potential Grexit. In Washington, D.C., Desmond Lachman, fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And Desmond, it's good to have you on the program again. This seems to be a regular recurring drama between Greece and its creditors. Is there anything different about this latest chapter of this ongoing saga that you think we should know about?
Well, we're now reaching clearly the end game, which makes it quite different. What we're seeing is the two parties, namely the Greeks and the European creditors, still far apart in terms of a negotiation, and time is literally running out, that they've got an IMF payment that they've got to make at the end of the month. And at the same time, they're bleeding deposits from their banks at an incredible rate. They've lost something like $2 billion this week, so it's difficult to know how much longer this can go on.
This may seem obvious, but let's get it on the record anyway. Let's get a better understanding of what the two sides are actually putting on the table in these negotiations. For the Eurozone leaders, what are they proposing?
Well, the Eurozone leaders, for the most part, are proposing that Greece abides by the agreement that they had reached last year. So in terms of budget adjustment, in terms of structural reform, reducing pensions, making the labor markets more flexible, they're wanting the Greeks to maintain that line. The Greeks, for their part, have just had an election. The election was in January. And the government has a mandate to put an end to austerity, not to do all of these reforms. So we've got two sides that are very far apart still after 4 months of negotiation, and time is now running out.
Has the new government and its sort of far-left anti-austerity approach to this issue, in your view, been able to move the Eurozone negotiators at all towards what they would consider to be their political reality?
Well, there have been problems in terms of the way in which the negotiation has been handled from a diplomatic point of view, that Greece has got a Minister of Finance, Varoufakis, who has been gratuitously aggressive, lecturing, hectoring his counterparts. So what he's managed to do is he's managed to unite 18 countries against Greece. So that was not good from a negotiating point of view. But the Greek government does have a substantive problem, and that is that their economy is deep in depression. The economy is down something like 25%, and they, with some justification, believe that this has been due to excessive austerity within a euro straitjacket, and now they see the creditors as prescribing very much of the same medicine as hasn't worked before. So there's a very big substantive issue that is holding the Greeks back from agreeing to terms they believe won't work again.
Both sides sort of, so far, always seem to go to the brink, and then at the 11th hour they figure out a way to buy some more time. Would you expect that pattern to continue this time round?
Well, I think there might be one last shot at it. That there might be some attempt, but one's not seeing movement on either side. This week, we've had the Greek Prime Minister talking about the European creditors pillaging Greece, using very strong language and saying that he's not going to be crossing his red lines. And even though Angela Merkel would like to have Greece stay in the euro, she is still indicating that Greece needs to move ahead with the structural reforms that it's promised to do. So it's difficult to see how they're going to somehow fudge this. Meanwhile, what is occurring is the Greek economy is back in recession, their taxes are down, their public finances are eroded. So even if they patch something together, it's difficult to see how this lasts very long.
I'm going to read something that was in the Financial Times recently by Wolfgang Munchau, and I'd like to get your view on whether you agree or disagree with what he's had to say. Here we go. The Eurozone creditors may well decide that it is in their own interest to talk about debt relief for Greece, Just consider their position. If Greece were to default on all of its official sector debt, France and Germany alone would stand to lose some 160 billion euros. Angela Merkel and François Hollande would go down as the biggest financial losers in history. The creditors are rejecting any talks about debt relief now, but that may be different once Greece starts to default. If they negotiate, everybody would benefit. Greece would stay in the Eurozone, since the fiscal adjustment to service a lower burden of debt would be more tolerable. The creditors would be able to recoup some of their otherwise certain losses. The bottom line is that Greece cannot really lose by rejecting this week's offer. What's your view on his take?
Well, he certainly does have a point that the Europeans might have an interest in extending and pretending, making it look as if these loans are paid by restructuring that debt. But there's a different dimension to this problem from the European creditors' point of view, is they're very concerned as to what message do they send to the other countries in the European periphery if they're overly generous to Greece. So to be specific, we've got an election coming up in Spain. There's a party in Spain called Podemos that is very similar in ideology to that in Greece, to Syriza in Greece. So if the Germans are overly generous to the Greeks, what they're going to do is they're going to give a leg up to this party to get into power, because this party will just say that if you stand up to the Germans, they cave. So the deeper concern from the Europeans' point of view is there have to be rules in this currency arrangement, and the Greeks are basically saying we don't want to play by those rules.
Well, how much of this then is really about hard-nosed financial bargaining versus just saving face politically for the rest of the neighborhood?
Well, it's not just saving face for the rest of the neighborhood. It's a question of how do you have a European monetary union functioning with a set of rules that if you just allow Greece to flout those rules, even though you could argue that those rules don't make much sense, you've got a problem with the other countries. So there are issues of a political nature that Munchau is referring to. Short term, you're going to have to admit kind of losses, but you're in a very difficult position that if you just cave into Greece, then you might be opening up yourself a whole lot of problems for the other countries. So it seems that what the Europeans have now done is they've figured out that they can contain the Greek crisis, that if Greece actually does default, introduce capital controls, and leave the Eurozone, they believe that they can contain that damage and somehow ring-fence it, present Greece as a special case, and then they can move on. That is a better choice for them than caving into Greece and then just introducing what they call moral hazard, where you don't have any rules in the system.
There are, of course, a wide variety of prognostications as to what would happen if Greece refuses to pay back what it's borrowed. Everything from an apocalyptic, this is the beginning of the end of the Eurozone, to, well, they only represent a tiny percentage of the EU's economy anyway, and it actually wouldn't be that bad. Let me get your view on that. Where are you on that continuum?
Well, I believe that short term, it's likely that Europe is in a very much position today to handle a Greek exit than it was in 2012. They've got a European stability mechanism that's got 500 billion euros. They've got the ECB that is ready there to buy the country's bonds, print money if needed. So they're in a very good position from a short-run point of view to handle the crisis. So I don't think that we get an apocalyptic result if Greece leaves immediately. What there is a problem is further down the road. If Greece exits, what it means is it's sending a message, a very clear message, that membership of the euro isn't irrevocable. So what it means is that if the markets have seen that Greece has left the euro, it means that when a country like Italy or Portugal or Spain comes under pressure again, markets will entertain the idea that that country too can leave the euro. So it makes them a lot more vulnerable to attack. So from a short-run point of view, I don't see this as causing a big, deep crisis for Europe. But from a longer-term point of view, a year down the road, the next time we get a political crisis or an economic recession in Europe, then we could have countries like Italy and Portugal really coming under a lot of pressure.
Let me do a follow-up as well about Syriza, the party that, of course, won an election earlier this year based on its, by the standards of the neighborhood, far-left anti-austerity program. Can they, given the political box they now find themselves in, accept anything other than sort of thumbing their nose or beating their chest, looking very tough against the EU? Or does that represent sort of the end of the road for them politically if they don't come away with something for the people of Greece?
What is important when you look at Syriza is you're not looking at a political party, but you're looking at a movement made up of many different factions. And the problem that the Prime Minister has is that if he accepts a deal on the European creditors' terms, even though he might believe that is in the best interest of Greece, what he knows he'll do is he'll split his party, and that'll bring a lot of political instability in Greece. So he's not in a position to appease his creditors, because what he'll do is he'll alienate the very far left of his party. They've indicated, there are about 30 or 40 MPs have indicated that they'll vote against this kind of program. So you'd have a political crisis in Greece if he accepts those terms. And that is the way you have to understand the kind of comments that he's making, that he's not going to sign up to a deal that betrays the campaign promises that he made some 6 months ago.
Well, I understand that, but on the other hand, I have seen polling that suggests that 70% of Greeks like being in the Eurozone and want to stay in the Eurozone. So how does Syriza deal with that conundrum?
Well, the trouble with that poll is it reveals that the Greek public is a little bit schizophrenic, or they're wanting to have their cake and eat it. So if you ask the Greek population, do you want to stay in the euro? What you get is you get 75, 80% of the population saying, absolutely, we want to stay in the euro. But if you ask them the question, do you want fiscal austerity? Do you want the reforms? Do you want all of the other things that the European creditors are saying are conditions to keep you in the euro? 75 or 80% of them say absolutely no. So they can agree to, this is causing the Greek Prime Minister a big problem, is he can't take Greeks out of the euro because the Greek population won't tolerate something of that sort. But at the same time, he can't push through the measures. He knows that if he tries to do anything in terms of raising the value-added tax or reducing the pensions, what the creditors are insisting he does, he knows that the Greek population is going to be dead set against that. So I guess what he's doing is he's just trying to muddle through this, but he's basically in a box. He's between a rock and a hard place, that he really can't accept these terms, yet he might want to keep Greece in the euro, but that's not possible.
Now, of course, much of our conversation so far has been premised on the assumption that everybody in Europe wants to keep Greece in the Eurozone. Are there countries, and maybe you could list them, that actually would be happy to see Greece leave and would encourage them to go?
There are many voices in Europe now. Even within Germany, there are divisions, that there are open divisions between the Minister of Finance, Schäuble, and Chancellor Merkel. Merkel would really want to keep Greece in the euro. She believes this is really important from the longer run point of view, where Schäuble thinks, no, let them go. If they can't abide by our rules, they're going to be a bottomless pit. They're really just going to be a drain on us. They're going to make a mockery of this whole arrangement. Letting them go will send out a salutary message to other countries in the Eurozone that you really do have to abide by the rules, or else there are consequences. So likewise, you can find a number of countries, places like Slovakia or places like Finland or Austria, where you have a lot of voices saying enough of this, that these Greeks haven't really played by the rules for the last 5 years. Let them go and let us move on, because now we're in a better position to deal with that. It remains to be seen whether in fact that is the case, because nobody really knows what happens if Greece goes.
Desmond, it's sometimes fun to read people's comments that they made years ago back to them and see whether they still stand by them or whether things have changed. So I'm going to do that with you right now, because 5 years ago you did write that, quote, European policymakers understand full well that a default in any peripheral country is almost certain to precipitate a full-blown banking crisis in Western Europe. Do you think that's still true 5 years later?
No, we've moved on. That what has happened since then is Greece did restructure its private sector debt. The public sector took over a lot of the private sector debt. So we're in a situation today where Greece's debt is mainly held by the IMF, by the ECB, by the European Commission, by the European countries. It's all official debt. It's not sitting on the books of the French and the German banks as it was 5 years ago. So if Greece does default, as seems very probable, that is not going to have a direct impact on the balance sheets of the banks in a material way. The danger is, does this lead to contagion in the rest of the Eurozone? And as I've said, short run, my belief is that they can control it, but longer run, this is really going to be very bad for the prospects that the euro can survive in its present form.
In our last few minutes, let me try this what-if scenario. What if I could put you in a room with Yanis Varoufakis, the finance minister in Greece, and his equal number from the European Union, from the Eurozone, and you were the guy who held both of them by the scruff of the neck and said, you're not leaving this room until you come to an agreement. What would that agreement look like?
Well, that agreement has really been proposed by the IMF. That they put out a blog this week. Their chief economist, Blanchard, put out a blog that looked rather even-handed. It said that the Greeks have to do certain things to modernize their economy that everybody agrees is required. They've got to reduce pensions. They've got to do stuff on the value-added tax. But at the same time, he said what the Europeans need to do is they need to offer Greece a lot of debt relief in order to make this palatable. So that would be the kind of deal that conceivably could be structured, is if the Greeks were prepared to cross their red lines in terms of pensions and taxes, then the Europeans should cross their red lines in terms of not wanting to restructure the debt. That would be the making of the deal. But whether or not you can do that, I'm somewhat doubtful, because there are really very strong political constituencies in both countries in favor of both countries maintaining those red lines.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Everybody knows where the finish line is. You just can't get there from here. So where does that leave us?
Well, it leaves us, somebody's really got to move. That Tsipras is making it clear that he's not going to be moving, that he doesn't want to do things that would really cross his electoral campaign promises. And the Germans, for their part, are saying that the ball is in Tsipras's court. They don't look like they're going to be bending. So it looks like there's a reasonably high chance that we will get an accident, even though there is the possibility that at the last minute, when both are staring down the brink, that they'll accept the IMF proposal in both moving halfway towards the middle. The trouble, though, is that the gaps do look large that need to be bridged.
Desmond Lachman from the American Enterprise Institute, we always appreciate your visits to TVO. Thanks for joining us again tonight.
My pleasure.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.